All right, today we're going to be painting something a little bit different. We're going to be painting this Instamatic 133 camera that I picked up at a garage sale a while ago, and I just thought it would be fun. Also, I couldn't think of anything else to paint. Please put suggestions in the comments below if you have anything that you would like to see painted. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep painting random things from around the house. So anyway, I'm going to be using a pencil. This is an HB pencil today. I've grabbed a size 10 round brush. Also off camera, I have a size 4 round brush that might need a little wash before I begin. I've got a putty eraser as well for any mistakes that I might make with my pencil. And I'm also going to be using some paint from one of my watercolor kits. So I've got some black and grey that I'm going to be using, and I probably won't be using any other colours. And I've also got watercolour paper from my watercolour kit as well. So I'm going to begin by doing just a loose sketch of the camera, and I'll speed that up for you because sketching often takes me a while. But basically I'm just going to be sketching by hand, so it'll be loose. I'm going to embrace the wobbly lines, not using any rulers or anything like that. Just going to be painting something very cute and whimsical looking. Alright, so this is, as I said, a very loose sketch, so I'm going to be getting rid of any of the excess lines that are going in odd directions that I don't really need. And I'm also going to just sort of erase kind of like a lot of it because I want my pencil to be really, really light. I want to only just be able to see it, which is another reason that I used an HB pencil and not something darker, because once the paint is over the top, you actually can't really erase the pencil. So I want it to be as light as possible before I even begin painting. Okay, to get painting, I'm going to activate my paints. It doesn't really matter which jar of water you use today. I probably should have started with clear water, but I didn't. Do as I say, not as I do. I'm going to move my pencil and eraser out of the way so I don't get them wet with the paint. I'm going to check out how my colour is looking. So I'm going to start with a light grey to begin with, and I'm going to paint this top section quite a pale grey, just like on the camera here. So to achieve that really pale colour, I've added plenty of water to my paint to make sure it's really lovely and diluted. And I'm using my larger brush because I'm covering a pretty big area. And I've actually decided that I'm going to use this same pale grey for the whole, I guess, outline of the camera, because it's quite a pale silver all the way around the outside. And also there's a line across the middle and around this, the lens, that are all that pale grey silver colour. So I'm going to do all of that in the same colour now, and then I'm going to add the darker colours over the top. So when I'm painting with watercolour, that's what I do. I start with my light colours on the base and then add darker colours, working my way up as I paint, rather than like with acrylic or something like that. You would work the other way around. So you would go dark on the bottom and working your way through to your lighter colours, which is really interesting. So I'm actually going to paint this whole lens in this pale grey, and then once it's dry, I'll go over the top with the darker grey. Whoops, that was a bit dark, but I'm just adding a bit more water. So basically, pretty much the whole camera is grey at this point. And I have just decided as I'm painting that I'm going to put make the, I guess that's the viewfinder. I don't know. I think that's the viewfinder. I'm going to make that a pale grey too. So pretty much the whole thing is a pale grey at this point, and we're going to let it dry. So that's our first layer of paint. All right, so this first layer is dry, and I'm going to now grab some of my darker grey for this bottom section. Hopefully everything actually is dry and I'm not just being impatient. Let's see. So I'm going to very carefully try and stay within the pencil lines for this section of the camera. And you'll see that it's quite a bit darker than the other sections, but I'm still keeping my paint a bit diluted and not super duper concentrated at this stage. And I have already a little bit painted outside of the lines and gone over the lens, but that's okay because, as I said, we're going for that whimsical watercolor look. We're not trying to paint anything that looks real or like a photo for that matter. All right, keeping on painting. And I did a little bit of research, as in I just typed what type of camera this was into Google before starting to film, in the hope that maybe it was like really old and antique and like, I don't know, I could sell it for $100,000, but the going rate on eBay was about 25 bucks. And I think that was if it came with other original accessories. But anyway, I had a look. So it's from the 60s, if I didn't mention that earlier. So I'm adding in a little bit more grey, or it's black, but I've diluted it with water to make it a bit more grey. So here we have the bottom section, and I can see over here that it's already starting to dry. And now I'm going to paint inside the lens. So I'm going to want to just paint, there's like a middle kind of circle that I want to paint quite dark, but the very center I want to leave actually a lighter color. So I'm trying really hard to stay inside the lines and also trying hard to talk at the same time. Basically, I'm just coloring in with my paint at the moment, and to do so for a bit more accuracy, I'm just using the very tip of the brush. I could, in reality, have moved down to a smaller brush, but I didn't really think about it until now, and I'm used to kind of adjusting the way I'm holding a brush just to kind of suit the needs or angles or whatever, the size of what I'm painting, rather than changing size brush too often, which I think is actually quite good because it means that you don't need so many brushes to be able to achieve a range of effects. Now I'm just dabbing in a little bit more paint, a little bit more concentrated paint here, just for a bit of shadow, depth and variety. I'm going to do that over here too. Well, I can see that this is still a little bit wet. It's potentially a bit too concentrated, the paint that I've dabbed in there, but I'll blend it in a little bit. Although I do recommend that once you get your paint on your page that you don't mess around with it too much, because you want to let the watercolor paint flow where it wants to rather than overworking it too much. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the viewfinder, which from the angle that I'm sitting I can see that I can see right through the viewfinder basically, but I'm just going to paint it as a darker square rather than painting in such a way that you can see through it. But I'm going to leave some of this a bit lighter. Actually, I'm going to paint going to paint the whole thing because I put too much paint on there. But while it's still wet, I'm drying my brush and actually dragging the dry brush through the paint to pull some of that paint back off again to create a bit of a highlight. So basically, I'm using a dry brush to take some of that liquid off there while it's still wet. And I'm also now going to paint the strap, which you may or may not be able to see, but I've just sketched it lightly coming out the side of the camera. I did forget to paint the little doodad where the strap attaches, but that's okay, we can do that now with a little bit of light paint. And then I'm grabbing some more concentrated paint to paint the strap in that really quite dark black color. And because I'm doing this whimsical effect with the painting, it doesn't matter how realistic the strap looks. I've just sort of got it sitting over to the side like that. Alright, I'm grabbing some of my light grey again, and careful not to touch these darker parts of the lens. I'm going to add a little bit more depth and detail into the center of the lens itself. And I'm using a slightly smaller brush for this too. And I'm using a lot of white space to allude to light shining on that lens. And I'm also going to start to make the outline of the camera a little bit darker, using just the tip of my brush for this, with the same grey that I painted for the base layer, but just slightly more concentrated to make it a little bit darker. I'm going to do the same with this line across the middle, being careful that if I do touch any of the darker paint that it is dry. And I think I mentioned earlier that I'm painting on a warm day, so for the most part the darker paint is actually quite dry now. But just be really careful of that, because if it does touch, it is definitely going to bleed and you won't have the accuracy, even though we're going for a very whimsical look, you won't have the accuracy that you otherwise would get if you're working with dry and wet and dry paint rather than wet in wet. So that's a whole other tutorial that I'll link for you above, or if I forget, you'll find it in my watercolor for beginners playlist. So I'm adding a little bit more grey, just like another line of grey around the inside here, just for a bit of a border, adding a bit more grey silver to the lens as well. And I'm really just sort of looking at where there are darker parts on the camera and going from there, and also making it up as I go a little bit too. So I'm now adding in a bit more of this dark grey that's almost a black in some places, and I'm keeping it pretty loose as always, so that there's a bit of variety and it's not super solid colour. So some sections are a bit lighter, some are a bit darker, and I'm really just leaning into that variety that you can achieve with watercolour, because the camera itself has a lot of texture, and so it's not just flat black or grey on the camera itself either. I'm also using just the tip of my brush to add a little bit of also just using the tip of the brush to use a bit of detail. Also using the tip of the brush to add a bit of detail around the edges, and I will be adding the text shortly, either using a pencil or brush. I am yet to decide, but I will have to decide very soon on camera. I probably shouldn't have told you that I didn't know yet. So I'm adding a bit more detail and depth just to this strap as well. I'm not being particularly fussy about like what's light and dark. I'm just sort of adding a bit of random shadow and detail instead. All right, and I'm going to add a touch of shadow below the camera as well, just so it looks a little bit more like it's actually sitting on the page rather than floating in the middle of nowhere. But this is absolutely optional. Okay, I'm gonna add the text using my pencil, being careful that I don't lean my hand onto the paint because I will get paint on my hand and smudge it across the page. So I'm gonna be really careful. So I'm now using the pencil just to add in a few more really rough, quite scratchy looking pencil marks, just for, yet again, more detail and that kind of thing. I'm really winging it. I am not super confident with pencil, but I just felt like this was a great time, especially working in black and white, to just give it a crack to add some more detail. And it's also good for a bit of shading and shadow and that sort of thing. And it's actually quite fun. So I'm doing a few kind of outlines with the pencil, really, really messy though, and not full solid blocks of pencil, just really just quite scratchy, lifting it up off the page a lot. So I'm gonna go around the edge of my lens as well, really making some of these points and things a bit more defined. Points meaning there's one point here. But yeah, we're almost finished, and I'd love to see your illustrations of a camera or whatever you want to apply this to. Maybe you have something else lying around home that you'd like to have a go at painting and illustrating. I'd love to see your work, and if you're working in black and white, that would be super cool. Tag me on Instagram, I'm at RubyTuesdayArt, and also make sure you subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video. I release new episodes, new tutorials every single Tuesday, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Right, see you soon.